Hey everyone.
Hello, hello. How are you, Honza?
Hey, doing great. How about you?
Yeah, no, very well, thank you. Very excited to sort of ask and answer a few of the questions that have come up. Um, I think the first one that we'll start with, I think although it was asked in Discord already, it might just be good to sort of have the pre-existing questions like in the video. So although you have answered it already, I thought it might be a good idea to sort of start there, which was the question that was asked in general. Being, does the new incentive proposal make Commune temporarily similar to how BitTensor operates, as in pre-DTAO?
Yes. Yes, that is correct. So currently, Commune has been running on local stake model,
Mm-hmm.
as everyone knows, and why it has been running on a local stake model is primarily because uh, just a second.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, so it's been running on a local stake model primarily due to the consensus that was running on the subnets before,
Mm-hmm.
which was a linear consensus. And as time went on, and we introduced this subnet update, and like the Cynthia subnet was introduced, and then the Mosaic subnet, and so on.
Okay.
Commune switched to a consensus that's called UMA consensus. You
Mm-hmm.
can think of UMA consensus as a proof of stake. Basically, the validators have to agree on which miners are valuable, because with the previous consensus, you could just say that, my miner is valuable and your miner isn't, and no one didn't need to agree with you because it was literally linear to the stake that you voted with. But
Okay.
now we switch to this UMA consensus that allowed us for the autonomous validation. Hey
Mm-hmm.
fam.
Hey-oh.
And with this uh, comes like the local stake model is no longer necessary, because
Mm-hmm.
the way it works is currently we have something called the subnet stake threshold, which is
Mm-hmm.
how much subnet has to have like stake on it in order to start getting emission. And currently
Mm-hmm.
it's 5%, which means that you approximately need something like 5 million
Mm-hmm.
to get emission going on your subnet.
Yeah.
But this naturally limits us to only about 20 subnets.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why we needed to adopt something called the like stake threshold is
Mm-hmm.
because let's say that anyone can start their subnet, and they don't need to have any amount of stake in order to get emission, or like just the minimum amount.
Mm-hmm.
What would happen is that you would just need that amount of stake that you put onto that subnet, so let's say
Mm-hmm.
10,000, to completely overthrow the consensus. So you have like 100% of the consensus trust.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is that there are many people that have 10,000 tokens, or that have probably even 100,000 tokens, or even a million tokens.
Mm-hmm.
So that means that it's the system isn't robust,
Mm-hmm.
because as currently you need 5 million stake, like over 5 million stake, to take over this consensus. And so far it's been working right, because it's assuming that all of these holders that have this amount of tokens, or like a similar amount, behave in an honest way, and so far
Mm-hmm.
they pretty much did. But as I said, like, this is not optimal.
No.
It's limiting Commune to the amount of subnets that it can have, and it's not as decentralized. For example, if you see subnet 17, there's pretty much just one validator deciding all of the miner weight, which that doesn't seem as decentralized. And
Mm-hmm.
now the route that BitTensor is taking is subnet tokens,
Yeah.
but we, like, Commune is first, it's not probably as big to adopt subnet tokens. Like we we have to get liquidity into the main coin and not like trade subnet tokens. Like it would probably not work out, and that route is being taken by BitTensor. So it's the only way to go with local stake model. It's basically subnet tokens, but there's it's not really applicable to the path that Commune wants to take. So the obvious option here was to take the global stake path, and global stake requires subnet pricing. Now, what is subnet pricing? I'll go over how subnet pricing is being done right now. So imagine the current state of commune something as Dao on BitTensor. So you basically how many tokens are on specific subnet that determines how much of the emission is flowing to that subnet. So if subnet has
proof of stake,
rather as Dao, or like it's not a form of proof of stake. It's just like what allocation is in a subnet, like stake wise. That allocation will be emission wise. So if subnet has 7 million tokens, and the emission are like 100k, and the circulating supply is 100 million, then it gets like 7k. It gets 7% out of that emission distribution. Well, so the current subnet pricing is like very intuitive. It's just how many tokens are on that subnet. It's
in proportion.
In proportion. But when we adapt the global stake, you naturally cannot apply this because how would you determine it using like this pricing when all of the subnets basically have the same amount of stake? Because the stake that you have on subnet 0, you can have on subnet 1, subnet 2, and so on,
And so how do you achieve that then? Because obviously you can't magic more out of thin air. So how are you managing to achieve that this stake is going to be present on every subnet?
Well, it's not certain, but for validator to make the highest amount of emission, they will need to register on every subnet, because in order to get that API, because they can work with their stake everywhere essentially. It's motivating all of the big stakeholders to participate on all of these subnets to get the emission out of them, which means that everyone who will be like sophisticated to get the emission will just move and support all of those subnets at once that are getting emission. So
so it will no longer be the case that there will be like a validator specific for a subnet, and instead it will be that validators will accommodate subnets, and then they will decide to sort of like split the emissions across all the subnets it validates for equally, or
yes, like yes, exactly as you said. So validators won't be on a specific subnet. They will rather operate on all of these subnets, like we see with BitTensor. And so that will give us like further decentralization. I can go over what this means. So if you've seen like if you've been like OG on the Cynthia subnet and mined from the day one, then there were maybe 1 or 2 moments where the whole consensus just the validators like stopped there, because there's, let's say, just 3 or 4 validators, and if majority of them stops and there's like some bug in the validation code, then new miners are being disadvantaged, because there's
they're not being redirected anything, so they can't improve their numbers to stop deregistration.
Yeah, essentially. And also, like this means that if you have just a few validators on a subnet that run the validation and they go down, there's like a single point of failure. It's not really decentralized. But if you have all of the validators on the network, let's say that would be like 30, being on that subnet, then 10 of those validators can go down, and the subnet will still carry on the operation.
Okay, so it's sort of like the idea that 100 votes stating yes is significantly better than 3 or 4 in terms of like the ability to trust the decision.
Yes, exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's another advantage that we'll gain from this.
Okay.
And now that we got the like benefits covered, and we know why Commune is taking that direction, which is mainly to decentralize and to scale, and also to allocate subnet emission in a more optimal way, because now I'll get to this point, which is the how will the rootnet work, and are we taking rootnet forever? Like, are we just copying BitTensor, and what's the like future direction with this? So as I said, because the longer subnet pricing is no longer applicable because the stake is global, we'll have to choose a new form of subnet pricing, and the subnet pricing that majority of people here might be familiar is the rootnet on BitTensor, which is that you have some amount of validators on the subnet 0 that basically decide the emission allocation to the other subnet. So you can imagine subnet 0 being just another subnet where the miners are the subnet themselves, and the validators there decide how the emission flow to those subnets, as if those subnets would be the miners themselves. So it's like a market on markets.
Yeah.
And we're going to take this direction in a bit more accessible way. So we'll allow much more seats on the rootnet than BitTensor does, and
Because they currently allow only 64, is that correct?
yes, we're going to do something about like 200.
Okay, and so how are these going to be the same validators per se that are going to be validating on the subnets as well themselves with the stake applied to them, or are these going to be like separate validators that won't necessarily be staked to?
These will be the ones that are operating on the subnet themselves as well.
Okay, so all of the validators are necessarily sort of going to have to be tweaked in a way that they can validate for every subnet, or is that slightly different?
No, it will be very easy. You basically handle the subnet 0 pricing the same way that you would handle validation on every other subnet, just with one thing in mind, which is that the miners there on that subnet 0 are the subnets themselves, and it's not like it's not some APIs,
Okay.
So
And so are
it will
they?
be.
Is how well they mine on subnet 0 going to dictate the portion of emissions they get from the validators, or are the owners of the validators going to dictate that, or how is that going to work?
Yeah, so the way it will work is on subnet 0, if you register there, you have to have more stake than the least staked validator there. So let's say that it's filled up with validators on S0, and then the least staked validator has 20,000 tokens. Then in order to register on subnet 0, so the rootnet, you will need at least one more token than the lowest stake validator, so like 20,000 and one token.
Is that for like specifically the 200 that you were thinking?
Yeah.
Okay, carry on, sorry.
And the rootnet participation, in the way that we'll go with it, won't have any emission allocation to it, and it will be purely just incentive for that validators to participate there, because they are like so large that it's in their incentive, like on BitTensor, to basically dictate the subnet emission, because it benefits their own values, I guess. So their own validating. It affects themselves, so you don't need to allocate the emission into the root net.
So how would it work, for example, if you had one validator with 20,000 stake, and it was validating two subnets, would it split the equivalent emissions or the proportional emissions of 10,000 to each? Or is there a way to like sort of only push it all towards one and like have malicious actors in that way? Or like how exactly is that sort of breakdown?
No, there's the way it works is the consensus of the rootnet is not fully linear. There's something called the UMA consensus 1 or UMA consensus 0, call it any way you want, which is the old consensus that's being that was used on BitTensor. They upgraded to the new UMA consensus, but their rootnet still uses this one. And the way it works is that there's sigmoid applied over that distribution. So you need some amount of stake that's within that sigmoid activation. So the weights are being like counted in. Otherwise, you're basically cheating. So you have to have some kind of agreement that doesn't really need to be 51%, but it needs to be at least at the point of that sigmoid activation. So you cannot just straight up say that I like, I don't know, subnet 50 and no one else agrees with you, then your weight would just go to waste. So
Okay. But then who necessarily sets like the distribution all the way? So let's say everybody agrees on that like the subnets are okay, and you're only validating on two subnets. Is it going to split your validator's emissions between those two, or is it going to look? Are you able to control how much goes where?
Yeah, you are able to control. You are able to control how much goes where. Like you can say that 1% goes to this one and 99 goes to the other one. It's the same as validator validating miners.
Okay, so is there like, do you foresee that could potentially lead to an issue with like new subnets launching? Because technically what's going to happen is you're going to have to validate for another subnet, and that will reduce the emissions of others. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, yes. I mean, it's important to say that the number of subnets will still probably have to stay limited. Like we cannot scale to infinity because we would have to apply a different subnet pricing logic, which I maybe want to briefly touch in this call, like which will be the replacement of rootnet. But yes, you're essentially correct. Like every time new subnet comes in, you'll if you want to support that subnet, it will like reduce the emission distribution from the other subnets.
Okay, but this is only really like a stopgap to sort of like make things more accessible and prevent any malicious actors that we currently have, because it's a more robust version. But it's definitely not the end, as you said. There's like another step beyond this that you're looking at.
Yes, it will definitely improve our emission distribution, like among subnets. For example, although we're going to apply the whitelist onto subnet 0 like very soon, and we're also going to basically just that, and we're going to improve the UI of that subnet that has other consensus than the other ones. But for example, it's very arguable that the emission should be going there or to other subnets. I'm not going to name, but what's this global stake and the subnet pricing going to do? And I'm very sure of that is much more effective subnet allocation. And I also think that it's going to decentralize the subnet validation by a lot. So there's not going to be like downtime for validators because there's just going to be more of them like validating single subnet and I think that it will like improve the overall network robustness. Although we're getting more closer to BitTensor, but the current like mission that we need to aim for is to make sure that the emissions are being allocated to like proper builders and that there's no malicious activity going on. And
Okay, so that's like the issue that you're attempting to combat, as it were, because it wasn't necessarily clear in the proposal what exactly we're trying to sort of like fix or
yes,
get around, but that's specifically like the fact that there's
it's
like an imbalance in where emissions are going in the stake, and there's some
yeah,
malicious actors potentially in the system.
yeah, it's
Mhm.
primarily like those three things. We need to get better decentralization on a subnet level where not a single validator controls the emission on subnets like we see on some subnets currently. We need to improve the subnet emission allocation, like to like currently it's very inefficient.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just overall the current state of commune is much um, like more advantageous to the global stake rather than the local stake model that we're currently using.
Yeah, it doesn't solve everything, but it's making everything a lot better while we put in sort of like scaffolding. For example, it's kind of scaffolding the project to stabilize
Yes.
everything while we then build upon it some more a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So then the only other thing that I'm looking at here is there any sort of definition to what the consensus parameters kappa and rho were? Because they were listed, but there wasn't really any indication on what exactly are they, what do they do, how do they function, that kind of thing.
Yes, we'll introduce it more in the proposal itself, but just very quickly, it's going to adjust the sigmoid itself. So it's consensus parameters that, for example, you can set how big of a agreement there needs to be and like the steepness of the sigmoid. So let's say that the activation is at some amount of stake instead of something else. So let's say the activation could be at 20 million instead of 30 million by adjusting these parameters. But we can describe it in the proposal in a more detailed way if anyone wants to read about that and how that affects the consensus.
Okay, and so that's kind of just effectively going to, I mean, are they going to be easily changeable over time?
Yes, yes. We'll list them as a global parameter, so anyone can submit a proposal that, if accepted, automatically changes them.
Okay, and are you going to sort of post an updated draft a few days before you actually make the proposal, just so that everybody can sort of have a look at what these parameters will be and that kind of thing?
Yeah, sure. We can do that today.
Hmm.
Yes, but I would just like to say that the rootnet is really not something that Commune wants to have for long. But due to the need of like we cannot stop the emission, right? And we need to scale, we need to allocate subnet emission better, and we need to have larger decentralization, which means that as an intermediate step, this is the best option we can take because it's something tested. It was running on BitTensor for quite a long time. We know what to expect from it, and if we would be adopting something new, which we want to do shortly after introducing the rootnet, we would need like a larger testing period where like as I said, like the emissions are still flowing, and we need to make sure they are allocated as best as possible. So
Okay,
we feel
and you
like
said
this
you
is
wanted
the
to touch a little bit on potentially the next. So you said you wanted to touch a little bit on what the potential next step after this was.
yes.
Can I put in a question before we move to that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because I read your proposal, and one thing that comes to mind is there was a mention about the need for transparency, right, on how validator puts their weights, etc. Because if we look back at the stuff that BitTensor has been going through with collusion of, let's call it cabals, where you have the powerful validators, and I think they have 12 that sort of need the majority they need to assign weights. How do we plan, or how are you visioning this transparency sort of report from validators to ensure that validators are not colluding with subnets, where say there's a new subnet and I know him, he's my friend, so he's offering me a kickback of his founder share, and I'll say, yeah, hey, I'll give you weights, of course, and that we get these back end deals. Do you have some sort of plan on how we ensure that we get the transparency that we actually need?
Yes. So we need to analyze the state we're in currently, which is where we are currently at is that the activation is like purely linear to the amount of stake that you put onto some subnet, like as long as it's above the threshold. Which means that what you need to do now is just contact like the major holders and get the stake onto your subnet and get this sort of handshake deal in probably even much easier way than you would get with the rootnet, because what we could do on the rootnet is set the sigmoid activation very high, which would mean that in order to do like this sort of a kickback deal, you would need something like 35-40 million commune, which is very hard to
right. You would need to sort of have the kickback deal with a ton of validators to get that going.
Yeah. Well, I would say that like as of with everything right now that I listed, it's an issue, but currently we're facing much larger issue.
Yeah, and I also think it's I mean we've seen things that we could like, we've seen what other projects have done and what we could improve. So I think those of us that are subnet owners, we could sort of lead the way of actually being transparent and showing how we are evaluating subnet and putting our weights if we're a validator.
Yes.
The other point that I just wanted to, I mean, I sort of know the answer to this, obviously, but how are you, if we have a few subnet owners on the call potentially, what sort of changes in their economy would you expect from this? I mean, I would assume the answer is that they would potentially and hopefully earn more if they're honest and good subnets, and not less, because it's always going to be important that the honest subnets, that they actually can make a living on this. But I'm assuming the entire intention of the proposal is sort of to skew the emissions that way.
Yeah. So we currently don't have that large number of subnets, and still something around 35% of the emission are allocated to the subnet 0, which certainly won't be the case with the global stake update. I would be surprised if there's flowing more than 10%, which means that it's almost certain that if you're running a subnet now, if the situation with the subnet count doesn't change, you will get a higher allocation, because there's just going to be like 20 million of which would approximate to, I guess, something like 23% of the network stake that will get like redistributed amongst subnets running Yuma consensus. So there's that. And also subnets that have design that's made to run only for like a very centralized amount of validators, for example, as subnet 17, that they if this proposal gets accepted, they will need to change something on their transparency level, and they will need to provide I guess more transparent validation in order to maintain the emission that they're getting. So expect very transparent subnets that I would say is everything except subnet 17 to at least be preserved the emissions that they're getting. I'm very confident of that.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Honza.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you want to go back to the sneak peek of the potential next step after this, so that people can have a little bit more of an idea of what this leads into.
Yes, it's quite. I'm going to keep it on a very high level, because I would say that it deserves a separate talk, or like probably a separate paper. But what's the next step for Commune is getting rid of this rootnet as soon, like basically right when we deploy this global stake update, the next big priority that we're going to work in the blockchain will be this, which is a completely novel way of doing subnet pricing that I don't want to go really deep into this because I want to discuss it later.
Yeah.
But what it will do is for Commune to go into a very different direction than BitTensor is going with subnet pricing, and it will allow us to perform some. It will be very general and modular, and will be working very closely together with the governance. And if everything goes right, it will probably allow Commune to even later on adopt something as subnet-specific consensus. So, because the subnet pricing, if it works as expected, will be so robust that it's very like. It would probably be even more robust than DTAO, because if you would have like a subnet with dynamic TAO and they would like run a custom consensus, then the subnet owner can just allocate tokens to everyone that's joining in, and then everyone would just buy into that subnet, But the subnet pricing that we're going to introduce in the next proposal will be robust even to those kind of scenarios. And so I'm excited to share it a little bit later, but I just want to say that we definitely don't want to copy just the approach that BitTensor is doing, and that it's just that we need to make sure that the emission allocation is better as of currently, which I think is of interest of everyone, because if there's appropriate emission allocation, then you can see higher quality building and support to everyone that that's honest and building something for the ecosystem. And then later on, when this is implemented, Commune will take a path that's as general as possible. And it's every piece of the system is basically just going to become an architecture that can be changed at any moment, and is going to be as general as possible into ways that it would be hard for BitTensor to ever go to.
Okay, so like highly modular and adaptable.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, is there any concern regarding, obviously, if we're moving away from this root network as quickly as possible, this sort of multi-subnet validation and the preparation that's going to need to go in, obviously, for validators to adjust, is that just going to go down the drain once the further step is put in place, or?
No. What's going to happen is that the subnet pricing will probably improve quite a lot. So you can just expect a better choice of the emission allocation. Like it's going to basically solve the thing that Bowser was bringing up, which is these sort of kickback deals and like validators not being transparent. Like it's going to solve all of this. So it's just going to improve the emission allocation in between subnets, and it will allow us to go into directions like on a consensus level that would be otherwise impossible due to like cabal emerging. And we're basically I can give another sneak peek, like we're going to go outside of the stake weight paradigm, but that's about how much I can say to this.
That sounds really interesting. So, sort of like to summarize, the actual updates to like validation logic on the validators will still be prevalent and useful in like the step beyond this root network step.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. No, that's great. I mean, if anybody has any questions that they want to chime in, Fam, if you have anything that you sort of want to ask or speak about or give your opinion on what's going on, then we'd love to hear it.
Yeah, no, it's good. Yeah, I want to iterate. There are like key differences. Like we are going through a global stake mechanism, which does on the surface, like seem similar to BitTensor. But we're positioning it like right now. We could essentially the chain could be whatever it wants to be. Like it could literally like if the chain wants to make 1 trillion tokens in like supply and mint them all now, it can. It's obviously going to like have negative effects to it, but the whole theory, like when I created Commune, basically I wanted to give as much democracy as possible. For one, it's obviously it takes it off my plate, but also I think we're already in a much more flexible position than BitTensor because like basically we right now approximate BitTensor, everything they can do we can already do, and we also have subnet 0, which is its own like consensus mechanism, but we're paving the way for allowing any form of consensus mechanism because we've seen and like you know like people can agree or disagree with me and but like Yuma consensus is not it breaks apart in several cases and it's also very hackable. Like like you know if you just know where the mean is you can play around with the stake to basically like you know you could become like the sole person that decides where the validator should go and penalize from if you know like the allocation and like it's very jumpy and the global stake will improve that because with the local stake model it doesn't work very well with Yuma consensus. Like at least that the design of Yuma consensus. So global stake model obviously works better with that. However, like we don't want to rely just on Yuma consensus because it doesn't perfectly work, and we shouldn't constrain ourselves. Like I obviously I'll be honest. Like I kind of did not like when we did this decision. Like when we moved to Yuma. But like I allowed I kind of not that I allowed it. I didn't have any choice really. Like I can't like control the chain as I used to. But like I thought it was like a decent approach because like I'm like okay like I don't want to constrain like I didn't want to be stubborn and I feel like in order for Commune to be as flexible as possible, what I learned at BitTensor was that there's a very stubborn mentality, and if you talk to a lot of people that are in the community that are close to like you know the foundation, they'll say the same thing, but they're not going to say it in public. They'll just tell you behind your back, or like they'll just tell me, and then but I'm not going to name names, but basically the point being is that there are a lot of imperfections with a lot of these protocols. None of them are perfect. Even when DTAO implements, you're going to have a lot of ponzonomics distracting actual utility. And no one's going to solve kickbacks. Like DTAO essentially is just Uniswap protocol. You can technically represent all of BitTensor on Ethereum, on Solana right now for like $10. Like you deploy the Uniswap V3 contract and then you deploy ERC20 that you can have like a custom like you know voting system to distribute the tokens. But like this is actually not like that difficult to do if you like really try to do it. And so it's like and so what I see is like a lot of like repackaging of like marketing, and we need to like kind of step away from that and see okay what incentivizes honest voting, and how do you give if you're on okay there's two things I think we should really target and what everyone's trying to target but hasn't solved. The one thing is that how do you have honest voting that isn't based on stake? That is a key thing because stake-based voting approximates honesty, but it's never a full approximation, and there's always greed involved. And you have like self-voting systems, even if it's complex, even with like the anti-cabal systems, you still have self-voting in a more complicated form. That's one thing. The second thing is so honesty is the first thing, right? Second thing is how do you give a higher reward for earlier honest participants? So if I voted honestly before you, I should technically get a higher reward.
Why
like
do you think
those
that
are the
is?
two things. Sorry?
Why do you think that is?
Well, it creates more or less, it incentivizes more elasticity in the system. If you don't incentivize in a timely manner, the truth or what's like the most honest, like let's say working module, then like if you only have the honesty part,
then people aren't incentivized to do it quickly. So you need to have the honesty and you have to incentivize timeliness. And so what DTAO is trying to do is basically use like Uniswap protocol / Ponzonomics, like / price protocols to basically be like, okay, if I stake onto this before everyone else, I can pull out while they're staked onto me, because the more people that stake, the higher the price with respect to Tau goes,
Right.
or like the native currency. And then if like early stakers, the more stakers that stake after you, the more you can unstake, like the more incentive you have to unstake. And I've talked with Const a bit about this. I don't think they, I don't think they know of a way to prevent like pump and dumps. There are some mechanisms that they're using, like cost, they're using moving averages for the cost, the pricing. That might help a little bit, but like I just know some of the people there. Like for instance, Floppy Fish is a great example, and he's probably mining on Commune too. And like they're just like really greedy people, right? And they're willing to do anything to like maximize their own dollar. And like obviously a lot of people here want money, sure, but it's like there's some people that are like psychopathic and they're trying to optimize everything, right? It's like,
Okay.
and those people, I do not want to them being in Commune. I don't think they have a place to exist. And yeah, like, you know, I think we should to way to weed out those people is we need to incentivize honesty, as well as like earliness of honesty as well.
I think the only thing to keep in mind is that when we try and incentivize speed, we have to worry that we're not rushing people into making uninformed decisions. But I mean, I definitely think that there's an element of like maybe in hindsight for some people, the route that we've taken through Yuma consensus wasn't correct. But you know, we're able to iterate on it time and time again and show really how adaptable the protocol actually is. I think at a base level. But if nobody else has any more questions for Honza about the proposal or potentially anything else that's coming up in the future, then we want to thank everybody for attending. So we'll just give it a minute to see if anybody has any sort of like last minute questions. I mean, for anyone really, not explicitly towards Honza. If anybody has anything they want to ask, then by all means go ahead. No, I want to thank you again, Honza, for taking the time to come up and talk about the proposal and sort of go a little bit more in depth and explain a little bit more about what's going on. And we look forward to sort of seeing like the slightly updated version of the proposal.
Yep, sure. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, that was a pleasure having you. But thank you again to everybody, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, guys.
Take care. Yeah, thanks. Peace.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Cheers.